Helena, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to have you here to talk about food policy and all the ways in which we are forked in this country. Why don't we just jump right into it? So, as you know, every episode we start with something called the double take, which is something that's in the food policy news that just like makes your eyes kind of bug out because it's so crazy. Usually because it's crazy bad. So, tell me what's the double take for this episode?
So I think right now the entire internet is a bit of a blaze about Trump's pick for Surgeon General, Casey Means. So for those of you who don't maybe know who Casey Means is, I guess by now probably we've all seen the headlines, but Casey is I guess I should say Dr. Means is a Stanford trained ear, nose, and throat. I always get the
Former doctor, right? Shouldn't we say former doctor?
She is. You still are an MD if you graduate from med school,
right,
but she did
fair
not
enough.
finish her surgical residency, and she does not have an active medical license. And
Fair enough.
But the Surgeon General position is often referred to as the nation's doctor. So there's a lot of criticism and heartburn about the fact that she's not like a practicing physician.
Yeah. Let's walk through the whole mishigas, as we say here in New York City. This starts off with Donald Trump nominating somebody else for the Surgeon General position. So why don't we start there?
I don't remember that lady's name.
Okay, so that is,
do that. Yeah.
I can do that. Her name is Jeanette Nashewat, and she is in fact a doctor.
Mhm.
And she's a senior official or a director, I believe, for City MD, the clinics, the national chain of clinics, and also, of course, because this is Donald Trump, she is a Fox News contributor. And he nominated her to be the Surgeon General. And then right before she was supposed to speak to Congress and testify, she withdrew. And the reason why she withdrew was from criticism from Laura Loomer, who didn't find her sufficiently anti-vaccine enough. During the pandemic, while she was working for City MD, Nashayat, and I hope I'm saying that even vaguely correct, I apologize, called the COVID vaccines a gift from God, which I don't know, maybe it's a gift from the CDC, maybe a gift from the NIH, maybe it's a gift from Pfizer, take your pick. But then later on, she was a vocal opponent of vaccine mandates. So she's kind of in the middle on the vaccine spectrum, which is not good enough for somebody like Laura Loomer. She withdraws.
You should explain who Laura Loomer is.
I think you should explain who.
Well, she's a provocateur,
yeah,
conspiratorial voice, very prominent on social media, very close to President Trump, has in the past gotten other very high-profile members of his administration fired. Like, she is a force within MAGA world. I'll leave it at that, so you can go and look at her socials and sort of figure out what she's all about. But yes, so Surgeon General, we should maybe just say, is generally not like, it's a symbolically important position, but it's not a position that usually has a lot of like policy sway, or, I mean, most people couldn't name the last like 5 Surgeon Generals or any of them. I mean, it's just not usually a pick that there's a lot of focus on, right? Like we care about.
That's my.
You just
when
Googled
I think
that, didn't you? Yeah.
No. I remember him. When I think of Surgeon General, I think of Dr. Everett Koop. That's it. I don't remember any other names.
Yeah.
That's the only one.
So, I mean, certainly there's key moments in history, the Surgeon General's warning about smoking. Like, there's certain moments, right, where the Surgeon General, it's not an unimportant position, but it's not one that we usually have a lot of coverage of, like the confirmation or the nomination or confirmation of this position, versus like FDA or cabinet level positions like HHS, USDA tend to be more of a focus. So the fact that we are all talking about the Surgeon General pick right now is itself like very unusual. So getting back to Casey Means, I think before we even talk about her medical record and why that has so many people upset, you should understand that like the reason Means was chosen is that she is a key figure within the Make America Healthy Again movement, or MAHA. If folks are still not familiar with that phrase, we're going to keep reminding people what it is. But she is one of the most prominent voices within MAHA. She and her brother Callie Means, who is now not only a special government employee and White House advisor, but also a key advisor to RFK Jr. at HHS. She and her brother co-wrote a book called Good Energy that's been on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. They've been on Tucker Carlson, on Joe Rogan. I mean, like, they've done the whole podcast circuit, massively popular, a lot of following on social media, and they are really key voices in this whole movement that's come about very quickly and has become sort of thrown into the mainstream in like the last 8 months. So even though,
But also
yeah,
controversial figures, right? So, like, when you look at somebody like Casey Means, she is trained as a doctor, but then decided not to practice. She publishes this book, and it's really all about
she really
alternative.
rails against the medical system. I mean, she is an anti-institutional pick through and through. Like,
Yep.
the way she tells it is that she left her surgical residency, I think like 6 months before it was over. So we're talking massive personal and financial investment in medical school, in surgical residency,
Yep.
in a very good surgical residency. And she says that she became disillusioned with the medical system and wasn't getting to the root cause of like why patients were sick, and just that didn't sit well with her. I haven't actually read the book, but I think this is how they've like explained the narrative a lot.
Yep.
We've seen some reporting recently that some of her colleagues at the time don't agree that that's why she left. They said that she was like, crumbling under stress. I don't know what actually happened there. I think in some ways it doesn't really matter to what we're talking about now, which is like,
Yeah.
is she qualified for this job or not? So from there, it's not actually that she wrote the book first. She co-founded a company called Levels, which is a
Yes.
tech company that is based on continuous glucose monitors. So basically measuring your blood sugar. I think they have like an app, and it's this program you can do, and it's all about metabolic health. And a lot of people in the medical community don't love this idea because they think that continuous glucose monitors should be mostly used in people who have like diabetes or other, yeah. So, but I don't know. Some of that gets a little bit like,
Well, but isn't it's not just the nature of the company
yeah,
specifically, right? It's the idea that she is in this world of alternative healthcare treatments
wellness.
that
Yeah,
make
it's big
money.
wellness.
So
Yeah.
so when you look at her brother, like her brother Callie, he has a company called TrueMed. I
Hmm.
spent a couple of minutes just poking around on his website to understand what TrueMed is. And it's this idea that you could use via his company your money from your HSA, your health insurance,
Hmm.
to pay for alternative treatments. And I'm just going to read
Pre-tax
you
dollars. Yeah. So
pre-tax.
HSA, FSA. Yeah.
So if you look on the website and, look, Casey Means is not her brother, but they are both in the government. They're both pretty connected. You can
Well,
use
Casey
this.
has
Yeah,
not been confirmed, but Callie Means is a special government employee and the
right,
co-founder of TrueMed, just to clarify. Yep.
right. So you can use it for red light treatments,
Hmm.
saunas, cold plunges, workouts in the gym, and then supplements. Supplements through up the wazoo, quite frankly. And that's also a
Hmm.
technical term. Something called sprayology, wonder feel, winged wellness. These two
Hmm.
people, this brother and sister, they are high level, serious, responsible people, if Casey gets confirmed,
Hmm.
within the US government who do things like winged wellness and red light treatments. So that is, I don't know if you call that controversial or surreal or something else, but that's the context surrounding this stuff, I think.
And I actually don't think that's what's really getting attention here with Casey. I mean,
Yeah.
somewhat it is, but um Casey Means, I keep using first names because I want to distinguish between Casey and Callie, but we should call them, Dr. Means, or, former physician, practicing physician Means. She has made a lot of controversial statements. So I think
Right.
that's where there's a lot more focus. So, and I think she does do some affiliate codes around supplements personally. So we want to separate too. Like, she's not TrueMed, but she definitely does promote certain supplements from her own platform as well. But I think there's been a lot more focus on some of her statements in the past. Like, she's really, she talks a lot about spirituality and being one with nature. And there's a lot of like kind of almost like mysticism around like connecting metabolic health and
Yeah.
the earth and like
Well, that brings us back to Laura Loomer, right? So Loomer, when she
Loomer
was
called her like a woo-woo woman, I
she
think.
either so what did she call her? She said first that she is a Marxist. She called it a Marxist, and then I'm sorry, she's a Marxist tree hugger, and then she tweeted. President Trump's pick for U.S. Surgeon General Casey Means said she prays to inanimate objects, communicates with spirit mediums, uses shrooms as
Mhm.
plant
Which,
medicine,
by the way,
and
that's like
talks
very popular. Psilocybin is very popular within MAHA. So that should be not news
yeah,
to anyone, but
and
yes.
talks to trees. And I talk to trees too. I live in New York. Sometimes they get in my way. I have to say, get out of my way. Like none of these are
This is the
none of
thing
these
is
in
like
isolation
a
are too
lot of
bad.
people, yeah, I think it's look, the spirituality parts, the like communicating with nature, all of that is it's one of those things where I think individually there are a
Yeah,
lot of people who'd be like, yeah, like I feel connected to God and nature, or like they may like identify with certain parts of it. However, it's very, very different for
yeah,
that kind of language to be coming from like a surgeon
yeah.
general pick or the nation's doctor. A lot of her views are just outside of the modern medicine or traditional medicine. Like they just are. Like being, psilocybin is still illegal in most or doing mushrooms of any kind is still illegal in I think most places in the country, or it's federally illegal. Um it's not just that, but also like she's been a supporter of raw milk, which the federal government has long urged us to avoid consuming. And interstate shipment of raw milk is illegal in this country because of the risks to foodborne illness.
And she's pretty
She's
anti-vaccine too,
questioned the
right?
vaccine schedule. She's
Yeah.
not as overtly anti-vaccine as a lot of other advocates are. In fact, there's a huge war within MAHA now because a lot of the anti-vaccine voices within MAHA are furious about this pick. They don't think that Casey and Callie Means are sufficiently critical of vaccines. And so there's a lot of infighting going on.
Yeah.
So, but she routinely, questions the CDC's like childhood vaccine schedule and says basically like we should be asking questions about this. I believe she's also against vaccine mandates. So there is a little bit of I hesitate to call it like a moderate viewpoint, but it is sort of the in-between viewpoint where you're not like full blown. I mean, some of the most ardent anti-vaccine advocates literally think that the COVID vaccines have killed millions of people. Like without evidence, they think that. So, and they think they should be pulled right now. And I only know this because I'm now having to like learn about this world, right? So that is not the viewpoint that has been shared by either of the Mean siblings, and so I think it's important to kind of clarify that. So they're kind of considered insufficiently anti-vaccine from that strain within MAHA. And then
Well,
they're also seen as too critical of vaccines or questioning or sort of raising doubt from like the medical establishment, if that makes sense.
that totally makes sense. And I think it gets at some of these continual difficulties of trying to understand what's happening with food policy right now.
Mhm.
I mean, if you go to look at, Casey Means on her website has a my health wish list for the next administration.
Yeah.
And
A lot
right
of it's
down at,
lefty stuff,
yeah,
actually.
I
It's
mean, if
like
you
break up the meat packing industry.
break up the meatpacking industry, reform crop subsidies, create incentives
It's
for
like
healthy food
Michael
purchases,
Pollan. This
SNAP.
is this
Absolutely.
is like an omnivore's dilemma policy thing. Yeah. Yeah. And
Absolutely.
even he's
Although
into psilocybin now, right? I
yeah,
think that's
absolutely. Well,
true.
I wrote a whole book about it. I mean,
Yeah.
but then right down there at the bottom, there is Reform the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of
Mhm.
1986, which, that the question, for me is looking at themes of this. The idea that we find ourselves in this position of saying, well, she's kind of a moderate is it's through the looking glass kind of logic, right? Yes, things could always be worse, right? We could have someone who is even more anti-vaccine than she is, but that does not make her a reasonable actor for this kind of a position. Do you agree, or am I overstating it?
Well, I think here is what I see happening. The every single institution, so like hospitals, public health groups, registered dietitians, folks with all of this training, all this focus on credentials and like evidence. I mean, this scientific researchers, that whole group, like basically the entire medical system is like,
Yeah.
no, like
Yeah.
hard no on this, right? We do not want to basically let a massive critic of the healthcare system and all the questioning all the institutions that we, the public health establishment credits for all of these advances in getting rid of certain infectious diseases. We do not want someone who wants to tear all that down as the lead doctor, the nation's doctor. There is just fierce, fierce, fierce opposition to that. Now, if you look at the Trump administration, and Secretary Kennedy said as much, the reason she was chosen for this job is because she dropped out of her residency and is a massive critic of the healthcare system. And so in some ways, like the things she is being criticized the most for are the reasons she was also chosen. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here.
Yeah.
I do think that much more of the anger about Kennedy's approach to things and also all the cuts across FDA, CDC, NIH, USDA, I think,
which we'll get to.
In general, I think all
Yeah.
of that anger is going to come out a lot more towards Casey Means, because, Kennedy has already been confirmed. So I think there's going to be some more heartburn directed at her.
Because of Kennedy's
Yes.
success in getting into the position.
I
think that's a good point.
So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And it will be a test, I think, of where particularly Republicans are right now on MAHA. They're still pretty on board in terms of like they're not publicly really pushing back. There's been, a few letters to the MAHA commission basically saying like, be science-based, but no one's really coming out and like being upset with MAHA from the Republicans, like in terms of Republicans lawmakers, because they don't want the blowback from this like pretty potent political movement. I mean,
they don't want to get primaried. I mean,
they don't want to get primaried. They don't want to get moms flooding their phones with phone calls, and they don't want to get dragged on social media. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens.
I want to move on from this, but I want to make one last sort of footnote about the potential appointee before Means, which was Jeanette Nashewat. One of the things I think is interesting about her, which does come up, it's not breaking news here, is that she is the sister-in-law of now former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz.
Yeah.
And there wasn't that much distance. There wasn't that much distance between him being kicked over to the UN and her being asked to withdraw from this position as the Surgeon General.
I think there was also some controversy about where she actually went to med school, and I don't remember. Yeah. This is the thing, though. I don't usually pay attention to the Surgeon General pick. When you were like, oh, the other woman was, I was like, I don't. Because the reason I am now covering Casey Means is she has really strong views on food. Okay, so she's been out there. We should also say this because we're talking about food policy. She is very in favor of like only eating regenerative, organic, which is a really small slice of the American food supply. She's, very outspoken against commonly used herbicides like glyphosate. She's, in many ways, very, very radical compared to the food system that we have. And I don't know if or whether she would still be espousing those views as Surgeon General if she's confirmed, but I kind of think that's why she was chosen. So it would be wild because like even 10, 15 years ago, I think about like what the Republican pushback was against Michelle Obama just having like not an organic garden on the South Lawn, but just a garden that didn't use synthetic pesticides. And the pesticide industry lost it. They were like, this is, basically sending the wrong message about crop technology. I mean, they were really worked up about it. And now we're looking at potentially having a Surgeon General who's like, glyphosate is a huge problem. Like glyphosate is a massive pillar of the food and agriculture system that we have, and nothing, crickets.
Well, but it's
just we are in such a wildly different place now than we were even a year ago.
But the question is, what comes of that. I think sometimes you look at someone like Casey Means and you say, look at how radically different she is. But the question is, what will
Oh,
she
and at
actually
EPA,
do?
they're deregulating. So yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So I think
yeah.
there's a comparison to be made to Kennedy himself. There was an op-ed in the New York Times recently, and the headline is Kennedy is right about chemicals,
Oh
right?
yeah, I
And it,
actually have that up. I haven't read it yet from
right.
Julia Ballou. She's great.
Yeah. And it walks, but well, I take some issue with
I
the
haven't read
article.
it, so
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
she's great. You don't
Yeah.
like Julia Ballou? She's great.
I have no opinion on her one
Okay,
way or
okay.
another,
She was
but
Vox's science writer for a long time.
I mean,
Mhm.
she talks about the ways in which Kennedy is opposed to food dyes
Mhm.
and the ways in which he's opposed to chemicals in the food system and
Mhm.
chronic disease in such a way as if he's actually doing something about those things. And
Mm.
she brings up the grass rule and how he is working on doing something about it. And then if you look at what Kennedy is actually doing with
Nothing.
those
Nothing
things,
has been done. Yeah.
it's nothing. So we're sort of moving the frame of reference in a way that
Yeah.
is pretty harmful, because if
We are
none of the
pretty early still,
yeah,
though. So, yeah, both things are correct that it's
yeah,
very early and also
yeah,
nothing has been done. They have said they are looking at tackling grass. And in fact, last week we were expecting an announcement on grass and
yeah.
it never came. So I don't know what happened there actually. Um
Well, I mean, the
yes, and
instructions
not
that
a single food dye has been banned. Nothing has been put in the Federal Register. Um that said, food companies are under pressure to get rid of food dyes because West Virginia banned them and a whole bunch of other states are right behind West Virginia. And California has lots of states are also banning them out of school food. And so um we are it's a weird situation where we are in a place where synthetic food dyes in the US are on their way out,
yeah,
regardless of what FDA does, but FDA has technically done nothing I mean, they've said we want them out by the end of 2026, but nothing has been banned. Even the ones that the two there's two synthetic food dyes that they were like, we're going to revoke authorization of these immediately. These are the worst ones. RFK says they're the worst ones, and I do think there's evidence that's concerning about these two, but they're basically not used anymore. Like they've
right.
stopped. So you know,
Well, but that's what I think is
like yeah.
that's what I think is important about these things. The idea is not to look at what Kennedy is doing or people in the administration is doing and saying, look at how radically different it is. We have to look at the results, because it's not like there were Democrats for years lining up and saying, man, food dyes are great. Obesity is great. Chronic disease is
Mhm.
great, right? The proof's in the pudding. The proof is what you actually
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
not what you
Yeah.
say,
And I think
you know?
this brings me to something I think that's really important about MAHA and
Yeah,
um I mean just in general, covering any administration, you have to separate the rhetoric from the actual actions, right? So much of what everyone gets worked up with about MAHA, especially critics, is about the rhetoric. And I'm not saying rhetoric doesn't matter. These are government officials like saying, I mean, RFK said that our food supply is poisoning us, and he said sugar is poison. I'm not saying that like that rhetoric doesn't matter. It matters because that's a big megaphone. That's a bully pulpit you are using to say things. But if you actually look at the actions, I think that's what's important. And nothing has been done to reduce sugar in like school meals further than what the Biden administration had already
right.
that we've never had added sugars limits in the school meals program. Those are starting to take effect this year. They apply to a few products within the school meals. I think like yogurt and cereal and a couple other things at first, and then they phase in. And so, it's one thing to say these things, but I'm very focused on the actions. And I
On
think
the
also um, there's a lot of folks who get really hung up on, um, you know, oh, this is like a dumb idea or a dumb thing to say. And they kind of come at it. We're fighting so much in the rhetoric. It's
yeah,
just so important to zoom in and be like, okay, what has been done? And then look at those actions, right? What is the result of that action? I think
I agree.
because there's so much noise right now and so much of it's on social media and it's like very, and I don't blame anyone for being confused because like the news
Yeah,
changes all the time. They cut things and they undo it. And I mean, it's like, it's so confusing. It's confusing for me. And this is my job. to like follow
Well,
this stuff.
let's talk about the things they're doing. Let's move on to our next segment, and that's our forks and knives, which is just basically the state of play here in food policy. What do you think we should be talking about and thinking about?
Well, I think the theme of sort of cuts and where this administration is actually changing the federal agencies and potentially changing the safety net are like those are the pieces of the puzzle that get way less coverage because we're all focused on like the rhetoric, right? Like, and also the infighting within MAHA, which like I covered last week because that was super newsworthy that like there was all this fighting over, Casey Means as the pick for Surgeon General, which again, I normally wouldn't even cover Surgeon General. In fact, I don't think I've ever covered Surgeon General's like confirmation. So there's all this noise around that, but if you talk to certain like folks within public health or Democrats or just people who have followed this stuff for a long time, there's a lot of concern that everyone is missing like the kind of the real impact or the real changes that are happening. And I think one of those things that's being missed is right now there's a big reconciliation process slowly kind of churning through Capitol Hill, and it's like very wonky and complicated. But the main gist of it is that Republicans want to extend the Trump tax cuts. They want to do trillions in tax cuts, and so they're trying to find ways to
Pay for that stuff.
pay for that. And I use pay for that because like all of this math in Washington is very kind of magical and weird and without going into it, but paying for it is like on paper kind of it needs to look like they're paying for it. And so right now what's being considered are like pretty substantial cuts to programs like Medicaid, and SNAP is part of that. So SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, still known to many folks as food stamps. And the House Agriculture Committee has been asked to come up with $230 billion in cuts over 10 years. And the assumption is that like the most, if not all of that, would come from SNAP. Now it's really difficult, if not impossible, to cut that level without cutting benefits in some way. And so we're going to see what happens. The House Agriculture Committee is meeting soon, so we don't have details on exactly how they're going to approach this. The House Agriculture Chairman G.T. Thompson has said basically like, I wish they'd give me a lower number because he doesn't want to cut SNAP benefits themselves. They're fine to like make changes and like future calculations or make it so it's harder to increase SNAP benefit. There's certain things Republicans are fine with, even like work requirements, different policy changes, but actually cutting the amount of grocery benefits that are currently in place is a deeply unpopular and also politically risky thing to do.
That's a bad look. You're taking food away from people.
Think about a senior citizen.
Yeah.
Think about, a family who is already, food costs are so high, and think about what kind of phone calls you're going to get. I mean, they know this, right? And this is very immediate, maybe even more immediate than Medicaid. You may not realize that like your Medicaid's been screwed up until like you're seeking medical care, right? But the SNAP program is monthly. This is a very tangible impact. And so Republicans are trying to figure out how to make these cuts without, with, I guess, like the least disruption possible. And so we'll see. That's in process. But that is a big, that's potentially a big deal and impacting tens of millions of people. More than 40 million Americans rely on SNAP to help them afford groceries every month. So There's that. And that's gotten not as much coverage, in part because of how it's a wonky process. They're kind of early in it. The Senate also is not cool with $230 billion in cuts. And so there's going to be some compromise. We're kind of early in the process, but that's one big thing. Then there's also all of the cuts that have been made to key food safety agencies. And they're, generally speaking, what they're doing is sort of weakening the system. So the Trump administration hasn't directly been cutting like food safety inspectors. Like they're not coming in and saying, we don't need these FDA food safety inspectors. They've not done that, but they're cutting like the ancillary support. So like the staff that might help arrange travel, or like some of the labs that support the food safety functions were cut, although many of those have been brought back now because they sort of realized that there was a lot of pushback. It was deeply unpopular. And also, like, you need some of these functions. And so a lot of
Well,
them get
yeah,
undone,
yeah.
but it's weakening the infrastructure. And our food safety system, particularly on the FDA side, was already pretty precarious. I mean, we do not have, I think sometimes people think that like food, there's like more oversight than there really is.
Yeah.
Food inspections, they might have an FDA food safety inspection might happen once every couple of years at a plant. And so
Well, let's go over some numbers because
weakening that is yeah.
we have some numbers. I'm taking this from Reuters. They're reporting that there have been, including, cuts and also people deciding to take buyouts. 15,000 people have left USDA since Trump took over, and we're talking about more specifically. And I want to do a little shout out on this Reuters article because it's by Leah Douglas, who is a former Fern
The
staffer.
best.
And
She's
she's
great.
great. Yeah. So according to Leah's reporting, we're talking about 555 people from the Food Safety and Inspection Service, 498 from Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services, and 1,377 staff. I'm going to read this so I get it right. Staff departures from the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which oversees the national response to bird flu. So that's real. Yes. I mean, we didn't have a perfect food safety inspection service policy within the United States before the Trump administration. But this is, how bad is this?
Well, this is where I think it's complicated. Do I think there's an immediate change to the status of food safety in this country? No. Like, I'm not changing my consumption habits. My sister called me in a panic or texted me with like, what's going on with milk, right? Like, we've all seen there was like there's a lot going around the internet that like milk testing was no longer happening. And that's not exactly what happened. Basically, there have been cuts made to the labs that ensure that there is consistency among the lab testing. So it's kind of like the accreditation element of, and look, no one looks at that and they're like, well, that's a cut that makes sense, right? The cut doesn't make sense. I think most people who work in that industry would say that, but it doesn't have an immediate effect on like the quality or safety of milk. And so it's in this same theme of like, food safety experts are very nervous and very concerned about these cuts generally because we have, I think, a food safety system that was not the most robust. There weren't, resources just lying around to begin with.
Yeah.
So they don't like the cuts. They're very concerned about it. But like, is the immediate impact there? And I think I am not changing. I'm not like not eating vegetables or drinking milk or buying dairy products because of concerns about that. But I think the overall concern about stressing the food safety system, about defunding it or weakening it overall, those are very real concerns. And I think down the line, we could see, slower foodborne illness investigations or, less expert advice to like some of the things they've cut, or like advisory committees that help the federal government tackle like difficult food safety challenges like Cronobacter and infant formula, which is something that I followed a lot during the infant formula crisis. So it's kind of both things. Like, these cuts are very real. They do have an impact, but it's not like all of a sudden there's, food safety is like, doesn't exist. A lot of food safety is also handled by the private sector. Like, retailers have these, a lot of third-party audits and they have a lot of quality control that they impose on their suppliers. Costco's known to have like their own like very strict program about certain things. They require way more testing than like FDA does. And so it's kind of, both things are true, that it's like, it's concerning and it's also not an immediate emergency. I do think overall we're gonna see we're going to see more pushback, I think, on these cuts as if they continue, because so far the pushback has been able to reinstate a lot of these employees. Like a lot of the food additives people were called back. I mentioned
Yeah.
the labs. The inspectors themselves are not being targeted. But if you go over to USDA, they can't run meat plants without USDA inspectors. And so there's no scenario in which you're going to cut, like you would shut down the meat system. You'd shut down the meat supply. So
I mean, the
like,
problem
there's
is
some
that
real
but what you're
ramifications there.
suggesting is that the problem really is that it's not that the sky is falling, or to
Yeah.
use the forked metaphor, we're not running out of forks and knives. We're not going to be a spoon country in the next few weeks. But the status quo was not good to begin with, and the hope is that we have a government that can
It's trying to make
improve.
it better. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And instead, what we're saying is we're trying to take solace from the fact that the government is not immediately and disastrously making things worse.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we accept that as the metric, where do we end up? That's not a good metric. That's not a good form of accountability or expectation for our government. That is a really bad thing. It's not the apocalypse that we're all scared of,
Yeah.
but neither is it good. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's also a bit of a learning curve here too, that like any new administration that's coming in, it's easy to be sort of deregulatory in your overall stance until sort of the rubber meets the road and you're like, staring down like a potentially very bad like lettuce outbreak or, God forbid, infant formula crisis. Like these kinds of things demand a government response, and they have a way, I think, of clarifying like some of the needs around like having functional government. Um, so I'm not like excusing, or I'm not saying like that, yeah, the cuts are fine, but I think there is like, as time goes on, like basic functions like food safety, emergency response, like, I can see more people being called back to FDA. In fact, this is already happening. There's news reports that they're like hiring some positions back as contractors, or like, you're going to need to still put out recall notices, and the recall notices are still going out, although there's concerns they could be delayed. Like there's real impacts here, but I do think that many of these positions will end up getting filled, or they will end up getting filled with contractors, or God forbid, like a horrible thing happens and then they'll hire back. I mean, this is what we saw with bird flu. Like they accidentally or laid off a whole bunch of people and then they called them back. But then as Leah reported and as USDA said, like a lot of people are still leaving. I mean, if you step back, the bigger issue is that a lot of people will just not want to work in the federal government. And so it's going to be harder to recruit. It's going to be harder to fill like key roles. And there's just so many things we don't think about. Like there's a bunch of veterinarians that work within USDA to like ensure that animals are healthy, like before they are slaughtered for food. Like, I mean, just there's all these like basic things you just don't think about. But once you think about it for a few minutes, you're like, yeah, I don't know. I think that person is essential, right? That's a job we want filled.
Well, for sure. I mean, this is the thing that we are being confronted with right now. From my perspective, if you look at what the Trump administration is attempting to do, and it's not just in food policy, it's somewhat across the board, they're making very baseline posing fundamental questions about why we have a government at all, right? And what does the government really do? And if you attack those baseline principles, yes, it doesn't mean that the whole thing's going to fall like a house of cards immediately. The structures are too sturdy, but you are creating situations where things can get missed. Certainly, that could happen, and there could be some really bad outcome. Or it just means, and I'm changing gears a little bit here, your next trip to the DMV, which was always going to be bad, is going to be really bad. Right?
Oh, well, the DMV's real messed up because the real ID, I actually, anyway, we shouldn't go there. No, but I think that's true. And also getting back to a theme we've like touched on a few times is like, there's a contradiction within MAHA too about this food safety stuff, because so many of the healthiest foods that we are urged to eat, fruits and vegetables, proteins, those can be the riskiest, right? Like, there's lots of foodborne illness outbreaks tied to fresh foods, fruits and vegetables. They don't go through a kill step. Meat and poultry, like there's a reason we have continuous inspection for those products, because like way back in the day, the meat plants were horrifying and they were filthy. And, you can go back to the days of the jungle and Teddy Roosevelt and read about that. Like, Poison Squad is a great book. If anyone hasn't read it, it's by Deborah Blum. It's very, very good about this period of time in history. Like there's a reason we have these regulations. So, if down the road we're all going to be really serious about eating more whole foods, more fresh foods, which is I think what the dietary guidelines are probably going to say, because they have a chance to rewrite those this year, some food safety guardrails around making sure those products get to market without making people sick is, it would be
Probably a
aligned.
good thing.
It would be aligned.
Yes.
It would be
It would probably
MAHA
be a good thing.
aligned. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my God.
All right. So that's all kind of a bummer, I gotta say. So let's change gears a little bit for our final segment, which is our good vibes, where we talk about something. It doesn't have to be fantastic, doesn't have to be amazing, but something that we can pull some optimism out of
We don't want to
food
bum
policy.
everyone out. Yeah.
Yes. What are we thinking of?
So, I mean, you had this great idea because I guess you listened to this podcast, and what was it called? But so people should go listen to it. I haven't listened to it yet.
Yes, it's an interesting podcast. It's called "Why Should I Trust You?" And I don't know if they're referring to me. You should definitely trust me. But
don't trust anyone, do you?
Yes, it's hosted by Brinda Adhikari. She is an interesting person because she was the showrunner for the now canceled show on Apple, The Problem with Jon Stewart. She's a very deeply experienced. That did get canceled. Or he walked. I don't remember. He walked out on it because he felt like he was getting too much editorial control from Apple. They didn't want him criticizing Apple, I believe.
Oh, I missed that. Okay.
Don't trust me on that.
Are we on Apple?
Yeah. Anyway, she hosted what she called a rare conversation between MAHA grassroots and public health officials. What she did was there was a MAHA grassroots chapter in Ohio, and she brought in a number of people from that group, and then also got a number of, I don't know how you would call them, people who are involved in public health who are not in MAHA.
They're institutionalists. They're
institutionalists. There you go.
Yeah, epidemiologists, registered dietitians. Like, I don't know if was there some doctors in there maybe?
I think so. And what she had them do,
part of the system. Yeah.
Yes. She had them talk to each other. And the positive part of it, and I'll let you talk to some of the things that you thought were interesting as well, was that they seemed to, after an hour or whatever of conversation, not to disagree on everything. They didn't agree on they didn't agree on that many things maybe, but they didn't hate each other, and they were able to have a civil conversation about issues within food and health. And I don't know that I always agree with the idea of like, well, you should talk to your rivals and make sure that you find common ground, because sometimes things are right and sometimes things are wrong. But I think an openness to find out what the other guy is up to is probably a good thing.
Do you have a family that doesn't talk politics at holidays? Is your family not divided enough?
No, we're all agreeing with each other.
Oh, okay, well then that doesn't count. Yeah, no.
But we're all screaming at each other anyway.
With you so strongly. Yeah.
All right, go ahead. Tell me.
No. So I think, look, there surely on certain things, yes, there's right and wrong. There's values. Like I'm not disagreeing with you there, but I think part of the problem of where we are now is that people are like, don't talk about politics at Thanksgiving. If people disagree, like I think that's part of the problem. Like you have to be able to have civil conversations even when there's like deep disagreements. That is just my opinion. And I do have a politically divided family, certain parts of it. So, but what I found interesting about this is that I haven't listened to the series, and I'm going to. I think folks who probably listen to this podcast would enjoy it. But I had seen a thread about it, and I actually shared this with a couple of other folks because I thought it was really interesting. And it was basically an epidemiologist had participated in this, and she was writing about it.
Yeah,
and she was saying like she was so angry about MAHA coming in and like basically denigrating this public health system that, she's a part of and that very much defends as like having improved public health over time, right? Like it is kind of both true that chronic disease is in a sorry state in this country, and also that we have made like amazing strides over the last century on infectious diseases and many other, treating chronic diseases and so on. So she said something like, I'm not going to do that. I was heartbroken. I was skeptical. And then she went and um, she said, what followed was one of my most raw, honest, and important conversations I've had in years. And some of her takeaways were really important. She was like, a lot of the individuals within MAHA like felt like the healthcare system had failed them personally. Like maybe they had a kid with some sort of health issue, or a family member who had been failed in various ways. Also, they felt like public health hadn't been communicating effectively to them. And what I thought was interesting too is some of the folks within MAHA don't like the cuts to public health, or don't want to see like NIH, CDC, or FDA. Like they don't want to see cuts to those agencies for things like inspections or, support staff, or there was just generally sort of discomfort with that.
Yeah.
And then she talked about sort of
well, that's what they voted for, right? That, I mean, there is, they always hear that there's consequences of elections. I mean, that's what they put into office, right?
For sure. But there are also a lot of more progressive folk, or there's like the Democrat, we talked about this last time, like RFK was formerly a Democrat. And so there are some folks who were brought along on this journey from Democrat to independent to Trump voter within the RFK pipeline. And those folks aren't necessarily like small government, libertarian, conservative, So there is some complexity there, but like surely, yes, Trump was very clear that he wanted to cut government spending. I mean, you can go look at Project 2025. They're like very, very clear about cutting safety net program. I mean, they're clear. Trump also at one point said he'd never heard of Project 2025. So I do think that was a little bit confusing for voters, but she also talked about some of the differences within MAHA. Like not everyone's anti-vax. Not everyone is like as concerned about food additives or fluoride or whatever. Like there's a lot of different threads in there, and it's really hard to generalize. So I thought in general it was interesting to see just more nuance about covering it, because sometimes we get into this like black and white thinking of like, you're either pro MAHA or you think MAHA's insane, right? And if you actually talk to people, or you look at polling, or if you go issue by issue, it is more complicated than that. And so I think that's what I liked about it, is that it got into some more of the complexity. And I do think some of the polling has borne this out. Like, I don't remember if we've talked about this specifically, but when RFK Jr. was going before the Senate, the Associated Press did some polling around certain issues, and they found that like the, concerns around vaccines were something that I think like, 30%, or like a kind of a minority of voters were saying like, yeah, I'm concerned about that. And then when you talked about some of the food stuff, like reformulating processed foods to have like less sugar, fewer additives, it was like vast majority approve across like Republican, Democrat, and Independent. So like there are differences of opinion on different issues. I don't know about fluoride. I don't know, but so if you go issue by issue, it is more complicated. And seeing more folks deal with the contradictions within this, and the contradictions between the narrative of MAHA and then the actual policies that are being put forth, I think is like kind of good. I mean, if people are just like, it's either amazing or insane, then I don't know how helpful that is, but I don't know. We'll see. I mean, we're so early in this. We're like, we just passed the 100-day mark of the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Like, we are very early in this, and it remains to be seen whether or not like MAHA is going to come through with like real policy and action. Like, and I'm talking Federal Register laws, right? Like we're looking at we have not seen that yet.
Well, I think we should leave it with that. I agree with you. Nuance is good. Complexity is good. If there was no complexity in the world, I'd be out of a job. I I guess I will leave with one thought from the brilliant mind of Yogi Berra, that it is, in fact, getting late early, right? So with that, I will say thank you for a great conversation. Why don't you tell everybody all about your newsletter and how they could find it and how they could learn all the cool stuff about the food policy world that you're telling them about every week?
Yeah, so if you're into food policy, you can go to foodfix.co and sign up for the newsletter. It's free every Friday. It's been an interesting, I think that I'm getting massive open rates right now because I think people are really interested in what's going on. So if that's your jam, go there. And yeah, I'm glad. Thanks for listening. Are we supposed to tell people to like review and call their mom and tell their friends about the podcast?
You should definitely, yes. You should.
I feel like every podcast I listen to does that at the end. Share this
just
right now. Text it to someone.
I just say thank you, and we'll talk again.